Thank you, everybody who is here with us today. I am Rosa. I'm with the Rhode Island CoC, and we have Housing Innovations with us today, going over this topic, and I'll pass it on to them. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am Lauren Peretti with Housing Innovations, and I am joined this afternoon by my colleague, Howard Birchman. And though we are always very happy to see you all on Teams, we will say that both Howard and I think today come to you with very heavy hearts, given the sad, unfortunate topics that we are going to be discussing today. So for those of you that haven't been with us before, perhaps on these sessions, Housing Innovations is a training and consulting firm. We work with continuums of care all around the country, and we've been providing supports to COCs for several decades. Howard is the person on our team who works most closely with the Rhode Island CoC. And today's session is on navigating uncertain times. The news coming out of Washington is frightening, and we know that your teams are very hard at work trying to provide life-saving services to people experiencing homelessness. And at the same time, you are being bombarded daily by news about changes in federal policy and funding that have the potential of having a very stark impact on your work. So there is much in flux, and it is likely hard for you to keep up given the enormous needs of people experiencing homelessness that you are trying to meet. It's probably hard for you to keep up on all of the news about what's going on with the federal government. So our goal today is to try to give you an overview of what we know about the changes that have been coming down so that you can use that information to help inform risk assessments and contingency planning at your agencies to try to minimize the impact as much as that is feasible for your teams and especially for the people that you serve. So this session is part of a series of trainings that's being offered by the Rhode Island CoC, and this session, like all of the sessions, are recorded and available on the CoC's YouTube channel and can be viewed at any time by anyone that misses the session today. So before we get started, Howard, did you want to say anything before I move on to housekeeping?
No, go on. I'll do my thing when I pick up on my half.
All right. So before we start, just quick housekeeping things. So as is always the case, Howard and I like to make these as conversational as possible. So please speak up at any time. You can just unmute yourself and start talking. You can raise your hand. You can put a question in chat. Don't wait for us to prompt you. You can interrupt. In fact, we invite you to interrupt us at any time. We'll try to keep in mind that some of you are new and we'll try to avoid using acronyms. But if at any time we say something that you don't understand, please let us know and we will clarify. I have put the slides into the chat box, so people should be able to grab them there. If you have technical issues, we know that some folks are having technical issues using the polls in Teams. So it may help if you try logging in through your browser rather than through the Teams app. The other thing is that if you're unable to do the poll right in Teams, no worries. Just think about what your responses are or put your responses in chat if you'd like, and we will go over the responses together as a group. And we are scheduled to be together for 2 hours. We should be able to get through all of the content depending upon how many questions there are, but in any case, you have the full set of slides available for your reference. So this is our agenda today. We're going to start just real quickly about talking about a very simple framework that you can use for thinking about how to do a risk assessment. And then we're going to talk about where we are in terms of the CoC funding process and the 2026 federal budget. I'll then pass it over to Howard, and he's going to talk about the new grant agreement terms that you are required to sign for your 2024 awards. He's also going to be talking some about various executive orders and about strategies that you can use on your team to try to help folks to manage all of this uncertainty. And then in particular, some strategies for making sure that as you do that, the way that you're communicating with both staff and tenants, participants, is trauma informed. And then he'll also talk a little bit about some contingency planning strategies. So before we do that, we always like to start on a little bit of a positive note here. So we're a fairly big group. We're not going to have time for everybody to go around and introduce themselves. But if you can just take a moment to introduce yourselves to each other and to us in the chat. You can say what agency you're with, what job you do at that agency, where you're located in Rhode Island. And again, to start it off on a little bit of a light note, share with us what your favorite summer food is. So for me, I love a tomato sandwich. The more mayo, the better. On good sourdough bread is my favorite. But so get that information going there in the chat, and I am gonna talk about the first topic.
But just a second,
yeah.
Lauren, if I could jump in while they're talking about their favorite foods. I just want to say, in the event that any opinions are expressed during this session, they are not the opinions of Rhode Island Housing, the Rhode Island Continuum of Care. They are only the opinions of the person who might have expressed them during the course of this and should not be treated as representing the opinions of others. So thank you, because sometimes this topic can provoke opinions.
Thank you, Howard. All right, so get those introductions in there. All right, so we're going to be talking today about changes to federal policy and also funding that present real risks to your agencies and the people that you serve. So many of you might already be familiar with this very simple framework for thinking about how to assess these risks. As I said earlier, with so much new information emerging on a daily basis, this is a really simple visual tool that you can use to evaluate and prioritize risks based on how likely something is to happen and how big the impact would be on your organization and the people that you serve if that thing were to happen, right? So on the vertical axis here, we have a rating of the probability that something will actually occur from low to high. And then on the horizontal axis, we have a rating of the impact that that thing would have, again, on your agency and on your clients. And again, rating that impact from low to high. So as Howard and I talk today, we will try to provide you with as much information as we have on the probability that things will occur. Admittedly, there are many unknowns at this point, but where we have a sense of how likely things are to happen, we will certainly share that. You are likely going to want to assess the impact that those things that seem most likely to occur would have for your particular organization. And you'll want to focus contingency planning efforts, of course, on the things that are shown here in yellow and red, right? So those are the things that have a medium or high probability of happening and also a high or medium impact. So that's just kind of the framework through which we're gonna talk today. So this is just a little bit of recent history that provides some context about why Rhode Island Continuum of Care thought it would be a good idea to convene this session today. So people may recall way back in January 2025, though it was only 6 months ago, feels like so much has happened since then. But back in January 2025, the Federal Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, issued a memo pausing disbursement of federal grant funding. And so what happened was all around the country, people lost access to be able to draw down funds from ELOCs. And that was clearly of big concern, right? Because it was unclear how long you were not going to have access. It was unclear whether or not access was going to be restored. And in most cases, agencies had already expended funds, right? Because this program works on a reimbursement basement. So you'd already expended funds. And if you hadn't drawn down yet for those expenditures, the agencies were potentially on the hook without being able to get that reimbursement from the federal government. So luckily, quickly, OMB reversed course. There was a lawsuit that was filed by the National Council of Nonprofits. There's a link if you're interested in more detail about that lawsuit. Everything that's in these slides today that's green and underlined is a live link, so you can look more into that there. But within, I think, a matter of days, OMB reversed that and restored access to ELOCs. And there was also, subsequent to that, a preliminary injunction as part of that lawsuit suspending that proposed freeze in funding. So obviously there's a lot of concern nationally about, what the future of the CoC funding stream is. And the resource at the bottom of this slide provides some additional resources, additional details on how you can think about risk assessment related to the potential loss of federal funding. It also talks about some steps that you might want to consider to avoid running afoul of the many executive orders that have been issued by the president, and Howard will talk a little bit more later about some of those executive orders that are most impactful for the work that you all do. So that takes us here. So this is just a quick overview, kind of top level update on where the federal government is in the process of establishing a budget for the upcoming fiscal year. So for federal fiscal year 2026, which starts on October 1st of 2025 and ends on September 30th of 2026. So on the left-hand side here, you see information about the FY 2026 reconciliation process, that has already been passed into law. This is the thing that you have heard the president talk about many times as the big, beautiful bill, right? So that is a done deal, right? So that was signed into law on July 4th. It was a little easier for them to get that done more quickly than it will be for them to get the remainder of the budget done. And that's because for arcane rules of the Senate that I don't understand and won't try to attempt to explain to you, the reconciliation bill is not subject to the filibuster in the Senate, which meant that they only needed a simple majority in the Senate to get that passed, right? That is not going to be true of the rest of the appropriations bills that they need to do. So it will be harder for them to do things without Democratic support for the remainder of the budget. So that reconciliation bill is not the entire budget for the federal government for FY 26. It only deals with non-discretionary spending, including things like Medicaid and SNAP, which are entitlements. And we will talk about the impacts on Medicaid and SNAP that law now will have on the folks that we serve. There were significant cuts that are going to have a real impact for our folks. On the right-hand side of this, you see kind of top-level overview on where they are with the rest of the FY 2026 budget. So the things that they refer to as appropriations bills, right? So the president released his budget proposal back in May, and then since then, the House and the Senate have passed their bills out of committee, and we'll talk about what is in each of those three versions of the budget. So as I said, on the appropriations side, that is going to be subject to the filibuster. So that means that they need 60 votes in the Senate to pass it, and the Republicans will not be able to pass a budget without some votes from Democrats. So it's going to make it harder for them to advance a lot of the agenda that the administration put forward. And this is where, on the appropriation side, this is where the HUD budget is, right? So that's how the CoC program gets funded. So it's still up in the air what the CoC budget will be for FY 2026. And that's the budget that will fund not this year's competition, but next year's competition. So this year's competition was already funded through a continuing resolution that was passed for the current fiscal year. So then at the bottom of this chart, this is a way that you can keep up to date on what's going on with this stuff after today. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition helpfully creates this budget chart that they update, and it shows for key HUD programs, right, what the current funding allocation is for the current fiscal year, right? What the president proposed, what's in the House bill, what's in the Senate bill, and ultimately when the budget gets passed, it will show the final allocation. So this is just a little very quick primer on how the federal budget process works. So, you know, theoretically, Congress has until October 1 to finalize the budget. As you know, we have definitely seen many times in recent years that they do not hit that deadline. And then one of two things happens. Either they shut down the government and, you know, the money stops flowing and, you know, programs, you know, core government functions stop functioning. Or they pass a continuing resolution. And that is, in fact, what happened last year. Last year, they passed a full year continuing resolution that basically funded the current fiscal year at the same levels that were funded in FY 2024. That could happen again. That's less common, right? Then they pass a continuing resolution just to carry them forward a few months to keep the government running until they can finalize a budget. So I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but just to say we are currently in the blue section in the middle of this slide, right, where Congress has currently, so as I said, the House bill and the Senate bill have both passed out of the Appropriations Committee, but neither has gone yet to the floor for a vote. So even though it could look from this graphic that we're kind of in the middle of the process, we're actually still pretty early in the process because a lot of the work goes into getting those votes, right? And so there's a lot of negotiation that's still going to need to happen in order for them to get the votes on both the House and the Senate and the Senate floor. So it's still time through advocacy to influence things here. All right. So this slide really shows some of the key provisions in the different version of the FY 2026 appropriations bill. So the column on the left is what the president asked Congress for. Then in the middle, you have what the House is included in the House bill. And on the right, you have what's included in the Senate bills that were passed out of the Appropriations Committee. So important to remember here that according to the Constitution, right, the power to establish the federal budget rests with the Congress, with the House and the Senate, not with the president, right? And so the final budget bill is likely to look much more like what the House and the Senate bills look like than what the president proposed. And that is at least a little bit of good news here because the House and the Senate bills look significantly better for the CoC program and other programs that folks experiencing homelessness count on than what the president proposed. So you can see on the left-hand side here under the president column, the president basically proposed two things, right? A significant cut to the homeless assistance grants, which is the pot of money where the CoC program rests in the federal budget, and also proposed basically to end the CoC program and fold that into the ESG program. We'll talk a little bit later about the impacts of that. They would be stark. In addition, the president proposed a 2-year time limit on rental assistance, on all different kinds of federal rental assistance. So not just for the CoC program, but for Section 8 and all public housing and all forms of federal rental assistance. So again, a little bit of good news, right? The House and the Senate both included in their budget bills increases from the FY 2025 funding levels for the homeless assistance grant. So just as a point of reference, in fiscal year 2025, the homeless assistance grants are funded at $4.05 billion. And so you can see the House increased that by a bit, and then the House increased it, the Senate increased it more substantially. The other really good piece of news coming out of the House and the Senate is that both bills do maintain, at least structurally, the CoC program, right? So it doesn't fold the CoC program into the ESG program, which means we can hopefully continue to fund things, important things like permanent supportive housing. So, and then again, both the House and the Senate, in their bills rejected the administration's proposal for 2-year time limits on rental assistance. So that brings us here. So we're going to start with the better news, right, which is what's happening in the House and the Senate, and then we're going to talk about what is some of the details that were in the president's budget, because we think that those things are likely to resurface again, even though they did not seem to gain much traction in Congress this year. There's 3 more years of this administration, and those proposals are likely to continue to rear their ugly head. So as I said, the House rejected the proposal to consolidate the homeless assistance grants into the Emergency Solutions Program grant, but the funding level that the House put in their budget, NAEH, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, has said is not enough to fully fund renewals, right? So not great news, not as terrible as what the president proposed, but not great news. The president proposed entirely discontinuing, like zeroing out the funding for the Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS, or HOPWA program. And the House bill maintained HOPWA funding at the FY 2025 level, which is about $500 million. And the president had also proposed to basically block grant rental assistance and to significantly cut the amount that states would get for that block grant. And both the House and the Senate also rejected that proposal by the administration. The administration also proposed zeroing out the Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG program, and the House retained funding for the CDBG program in their budget. All right. So one more slide on the House Appropriations bill, and then we'll move over to the Senate. So NAEH has said that the House bill did not include the DV bonus or YHDP funds for 2026. I think what they meant there is that they didn't include new DV bonus and YHDP funds, because I think that though there's not enough to fund all the renewals, there's almost enough to fund all of the renewals in that House bill. So, and this is the case across all 3, the president's proposal, the House proposal, and the Senate proposal. There is not dedicated funding to be able to continue the emergency housing voucher program. That program was a new program. I think it was ARPA funded, and it is set to run out of money in many places around the country before the end of this current fiscal year. So without continuing that program, there are about 60,000 households across the country who are going to lose rental assistance and face homelessness. And there's not good news there on either the House or the Senate side. The administration also proposed zeroing out the home program, and the House also did not include funding for the home program in their budget. And then the House budget also had stark cuts to HUD Fair Housing program, so a 67% cut to HUD Fair Housing program, and just an overall cut in the HUD budget, which really sort of formalizes the reductions in staffing that we have seen coming out of this administration. So that brings us to what's in the Senate bill. So the Senate bill includes, even better news than the House bill. As we saw in the table that I went through a few slides back, the Senate bill increases over the current year allocation, the homeless assistance grants, by about $500 million. So that's not as much as the advocates are asking for. So the advocates are asking for, I think it's $4.9 billion, and the Senate bill is at $4.5 billion. So, not as much as we need, obviously, to end homelessness, but far, far better than what the administration proposed. And again, rejects the proposal to consolidate the homeless assistance grants into the ESG program, rejects the proposal to block grant rental assistance and to lower the funding on rental assistance. Although NEH and the National Low Income Housing Coalition are saying that though there are funding increases in the HUD budget, they believe that it might fall short of what's needed to fund all existing rental assistance, right? So remember, in most places, FMRs, the fair market rents, go up every year. And so to continue to serve the same number of households, this is true in the CoC program, as well as in other kinds of rental assistance. In order to continue to serve the same number of households, you need more money every year. So level funding actually results in the ability to serve fewer households from year to year. All right. And then again, the Senate, like the House, maintains the HOPWA program and actually increases it a bit from the current fiscal year allocation. And it funds both home and fair housing, flat funds them, so same level as this year. And again, it rejects the 2-year time limit, but unfortunately does not provide the funding that's needed for the emergency housing voucher program. All right, so now I'll just talk quickly about what was in the president's budget request to Congress. So this request would have been much more devastating to programs for people experiencing homelessness and for mainstream affordable housing programs than either what's in the House or the Senate budgets. And given what we just discussed about what was in those two bills, the congressional bills, the good news is that the most damaging parts of the president's proposal seem unlikely to occur in 2026, right? So we're going to talk about what they are because, the advocates are saying that these things are likely to resurface again in 2027. So we think it's helpful for you to understand it for your long-term planning, that the direction that the administration wants to go. But we don't think that there's significant risk that the most damaging parts of what the president proposed are going to be implemented in FY 2026. So in effect, what the administration proposed was an end to the CoC program. So by consolidating the CoC program into the ESG program, all of the funding would then flow through the ESG program rather than through the CoC program. And so for those of you that may have ESG funding, you might know, right, that unlike the CoC program, where you get a contract directly with HUD, right, for the ESG program, HUD provides the funding to states and to larger local governments, right? And then the state and those local governments then decide how they are going to allocate that funding. So I think in Rhode Island, it's the Rhode Island Department of Housing that gets the state ESG award. And then I think there are only 3 local governments that have their own ESG award: Providence, Pawtucket, and Woonsocket. Howard will jump in if I'm incorrect about that. But so basically, you would have to, rather than get a grant directly from HUD, right, you would have to seek continuation of your funding either through the state or through one of the localities that gets an ESG award, depending on where your project is located, right? So if your project is located in an area that doesn't get its own ESG award, you would have to get your funding from the states. From the locality. So in addition to that, the president's budget also cut the homeless assistance grants by $27 million. So and then, as I said, it completely zeroed out the HOPWA program. So this would have a really significant impact on our program. So So it's important to remember when you're thinking about this that the eligible activities under the CoC program are different than the eligible activities under the ESG program, right? So if all the funding flows through the ESG program, that means whole categories of program types are no longer going to be eligible. And that includes permanent supportive housing. So permanent supportive housing is not an eligible type of program under ESG, nor is coordinated entry, CoC planning, youth homelessness demonstration projects, and HMIS designated grants would all go away if this were to happen. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the CoC program has a matching requirement of 25%. As you know, the ESG program has a matching requirement of 100%. So that matching requirement applies to the recipient. So it would apply to either the state agency or the local governments that are getting the award, but in many cases, those recipients pass on that requirement to the subrecipients, right? So if this were to happen, you could end up with a 100% match requirement for any grant that is now going to be funded through ESG rather than through the CoC program. And then the other big thing here is that the CoC program is a competitive application, right? So you compete with other CoCs around the country. I think, Rhode Island historically has done quite well in that competition. And so you've got, a lot of renewal projects that are accounted for when HUD determines how much money you can apply for, right? That is not the case under the ESG program. Under the ESG program, there's a formula that they use, and they say each area gets X amount of dollars based upon that formula, and it doesn't consider all of the renewal demands, right? So you could end up with an amount that is not sufficient to cover the existing renewals that you have. So this really would put renewal projects at risk. And so, the advocates are saying that so far and that this is reflected in what we saw come out in the House and the Senate bills. They are not hearing a lot of appetite on either side of the aisle for that consolidation, but that could change in the out years, and that proposal is likely to be put on the table again and could increasingly gain traction in Congress. So, all right. So the president's proposal also eliminates most federal rental assistance. I said this already, and block grants it to the states, sets a 2-year time limit on rental assistance for able-bodied people, and cuts the amount so that even though they're block granting it, the amount that it would be funded at would be lower than the current federal investment in these critical affordable housing programs. Again, right now, not getting a lot of traction in Congress on this, but the fear is that in the out years, this could happen or get closer to happening anyway. So we already talked about EHV, and then I think I said this already, the president also entirely eliminated 2 important programs, the CDBG and the home program. I'm going to pause quickly there to see if we have questions before I move us on to the Medicaid and SNAP changes. All right. Are there questions? And there's a lot of introductions, and I'm not seeing questions I see, Bill, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I was typing a question in the chat. I figured I would take advantage of the opportunity to raise my hand.
Yeah.
So I know that this probably isn't going to happen right now, but thinking about the consolidation and the 2-year limit on rental assistance, and assuming that like the HUD CoC PSHs would become those 2-year rental limits, since HUD currently requires a disability, would it exempt those folks from the presence of a disability exempt folks from that 2-year time limit if this change happened?
No, because the PSH program would be entirely eliminated, right? So because the PSH program is not an eligible activity under ESG, right? So people who are currently in PSH, like rapid rehousing, would be an eligible activity, but rapid
Okay.
rehousing already has a 2-year time limit in the CoC
Yeah.
program. Yeah, good
So we
question, Bill.
couldn't just shift people over to that new fund. I mean, I'm getting way ahead of things, but like, who couldn't just shift people over to those rental assistance grants?
You could shift people over to rapid rehousing, I guess, but it wouldn't really help them because they'd be 2-year, be 2 years, and I'm not even sure they would be eligible, right? We'd have to think through like the eligibility implications there. You can definitely do the opposite, switch people from rapid rehousing to PSH, but I'm not sure that HUD would find people who are currently in ESG eligible, currently in PSH because they're housed, eligible for rapid rehousing.
If they are disabled, they might not be subject to a work requirement, because expect on the heels of all of this to be a work requirement associated with any kind of housing assistance too. So maybe the disability will lessen the number of hours a month they have to work.
Good point. All right.
Thank you.
So sure, Bill, and anybody feel free, ask questions. So I'm going to move us on to the changes to the Medicaid law. So the next set of slides on Medicaid and SNAP are about the reconciliation bill that passed, right? It's law. So this is a done deal. So again, this is what is commonly referred to by the Republicans as the big, beautiful bill. And it's got real significant cuts to both Medicaid and SNAP that are going to hurt the people that we serve and other low-income folks who are going to struggle to meet the new requirements, and many are going to lose their Medicaid coverage and their SNAP benefits as a result of this. So folks might remember, thinking back to the Affordable Care Act, the good old days, gave states the option of expending Medicaid to people with incomes of up to 138% of the federal poverty level. And Rhode Island was one of the many states, right, that opted into that Medicaid expansion. And so what that means is that many of our folks, right, many people experiencing homelessness are now insured through that Medicaid expansion option. And the new law, as Howard was just alluding to, has significant new work requirements for people who get their Medicaid through Medicaid expansion. So if you are aged 19 to 24 and your Medicaid comes through the Medicaid expansion, you're going to have to prove that you worked at least 80 hours in at least 1 month in the past 6 months in order to retain your Medicaid. And that can include work, community service, work training, or I think there's some educational things that will count in that as well. And as Howard just said, there are some exemptions to that. So this is not a comprehensive list, but it's the things that people are most likely to qualify for an exemption under. If you're a caregiver of a child age 13 or under, if you're medically frail, and that means you're blind, disabled, you have a substance use disorder, a mental health condition, an intellectual disability, etc. If you are pregnant or if you are participating in substance use treatment, you can get an exemption. Now, we know that many of our folks are going to qualify for an exemption, but we don't know yet all of the details about exactly what the hoops are going to look like that they're going to have to jump through in order to prove that they qualify for those exemptions. So there's a lot of concern, right, that it's going to mean a ton of additional paperwork for people, and that our folks in particular are going to really struggle with those administrative burdens. And even though they probably qualify, are going to fall through the cracks here. And that really, frankly, was the intent of doing this, and doing it in a way that was not a cut, but in effect will be a cut. Elizabeth has her hand up.
Hey, Lauren, thank you. And tell me if I'm jumping the gun and you're planning to cover this, but I'm curious the timeline that, if you know one, that the states are going to get more information on what those requirements are, how they have to track them. Like, I'm just thinking as a system, when it would make sense for us to start engaging our Medicaid partners here. And I don't want to be too soon and just adding to their questions when they don't have any more information, but wondering if you have any sense of the timeline of when we should be thinking about doing that.
I don't know the timeline. I do know that like the implementation on various parts of this is like, it's not all going to take effect immediately. So various parts take effects and kind of the rollout is over the next few years, but I don't know the specifics of when the states, but we can, when we know, we'll let you know. Howard, I don't know if you have more to add.
I was just going to say, most of the Medicaid changes will come into effect in 2027, which means that sometime next year should be when the Medicaid offices are getting information about what it is that they need to do. Because obviously there's a lot of paperwork and documentation that providers are going to need to do to serve people.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So more changes to Medicaid. So states are going to be required to verify enrollee addresses. That obviously gets very complicated when you're talking about people who are homeless, and is going to be yet another, another burden for people to prove. Their copays, new copays as high as $35 per service, which is going to be unaffordable for a lot of our folks. And again, for the Medicaid expansion population, those folks are going to be required to redetermine eligibility every 6 months. So again, creates this churning where our folks are unable to jump through the hoops, and many of them are gonna sadly fall off of their Medicaid coverage. There are also new restrictions on who can qualify, based upon their immigration status. So before, there were certain categories of people that, though they were not legal permanent residents or U.S. citizens, could still qualify. So for example, refugees and asylees, that is no longer the case. Those people are now no longer going to qualify. There's also less federal matching money for emergency Medicaid for undocumented people. And, every place where the feds are giving less and the states have to give more, that's going to put pressure on state budgets and make it harder for states to compensate at the state level for some of what is being handed down at the federal level. And then finally on this slide, currently there's a retroactive period where when you apply for Medicaid, you can get retroactive coverage for a period that precedes the date of your application, and that retroactive coverage window will shrink. All right, so I am going to move us on to SNAP.
I'm just going to jump in and say quickly that there's never been a study that demonstrates that people become healthier when they lose their health insurance. I just want to put that out there for the record. And there's never been a study that demonstrates that when people lose their health insurance, they lose all need for health care. And so it's going to be a huge, huge burden on providers who are going to be stuck with these costs.
Yeah, or that they become more able to work, right? So, all right. So these are the changes. Again, this is part of the reconciliation bill. It's a done deal. Passed. It's a law now. So similarly on the SNAP side, there's expansion of work requirements. The work requirements on the SNAP side are even harder, 20 hours per week. And same, right? They narrowed the age window under which people can be exempt. So now people that are 55 to 64 are also subject to these work requirements. And then really importantly for our folks, there had been a categorical exemption for people experiencing homelessness, and that is no longer the case. So our folks are going to, for the first time, many of them be subject to these work requirements. And then it does the same thing as we talked about on the Medicaid side. It narrows the definition of who can qualify for a caregiver exemption. Now you have to be a caregiver only of children under age 14 in order to qualify. And then it also does the same thing that we talked about on the immigration, that we said on the Medicaid slide, right? It disqualifies certain immigration statuses that were previously qualified to get SNAP benefits. And then it also, reduces how often benefits are going to be adjusted to keep pace with inflation. That's obviously hard, particularly in this economy for folks. And then again, it puts more pressure on the state budget because it increases the costs and the cost sharing for the states. So Now we're going to talk quickly about what we can do about this. So as I said earlier, the implementation of this is happening over the next few years, and the states are going to have some discretion on how they implement. Like there's certain things that are in the law and the state has to do it a certain way. And then there are other things where they're going to have discretion. And I think Elizabeth was referring to this earlier. Advocacy with the state is going to be really important so that where they have discretion, they are keeping in mind the needs of people experiencing homelessness and designing as much as they can programs that are going to meet the needs of the folks that we serve. Critically, right, that people can qualify through Medicaid through several different eligibility pathways. So Medicaid expansion is just one of those pathways. And it's the folks that are in the Medicaid expansion group that are going to be most impacted by these changes. So we want to try to get as many of our people as possible out of the Medicaid expansion group and into the disability eligibility pathway, right? And the best way to do that is going to be to help people get on SSI, because if they're on SSI, they're going to automatically qualify for Medicaid under the disability pathway, and the worst of this isn't going to touch them. Now, getting people on SSI is obviously no small task. Certainly, we can try to use SOAR as a resource for doing that. Not everyone is necessarily going to qualify for SSI. There are people who will likely qualify for a disability exemption that don't qualify for SSI. So that's the, kind of the gold standard would be SSI. If not, you want to try to get people qualified for the disability expansion. And then finally, because we know that there is going to be a lot more paperwork that is required because particularly for the Medicaid expansion group, having to recertify every 6 months, we want to make sure that people have all of their vital documents. And a good way to do that is to make sure that that stuff is uploaded to HMIS. So their identification, their social security card, whatever documentation you have of disability, all of those things are going to be important to protect people as much as we can moving forward. If you want more information, there's a link here at the bottom to an NAEH slide deck that has a little bit more information on some of this stuff if you are interested. And then this is just advocacy, right? So not just advocacy. Importantly, this is advocacy. We need to keep advocating on the Medicaid and the SNAP side at the federal level, right? That window has closed. That's a done deal. The advocacy now there is at your state level. On the appropriations bill, that is still an open process, and we want to advocate as much as we can. Make those calls, send those emails. Calls are better than emails, and there are links here, this slide, for how to do these things. So, all right. So we talked about this the last time Howard and I were together with you in terms of, where we are in the CoC funding process. So the 2024 awards, despite the scare that we talked about earlier, those are moving forward. HUD has been processing those grants. So you should have those grant agreements either executed or nearly executed. I think Rosa had told me last time that almost all of your grants were already executed. So that is very good news. And obviously you had no choice but to sign the new grant agreement language that is in there, which Howard is going to talk about in a moment. So that brings us to what's happening in the current year. So we know, right, that HUD has announced that they will not be honoring the 2-year NOFO that they released last year, that there will be a new 2025 NOFO. There will be a competition again this year for CoC funds. We have no information about when that will happen. It could happen tomorrow. They could drop a new NOFO. And I think we have seen as late as, November, December. Theoretically, it should happen ASAP because the grants are going to start expiring January 1st of 2026. But unfortunately, there have been many years when grants have expired and the awards are not yet announced. We do know from the, brief message that HUD sent out that the upcoming competition is going to have a focus on treatment and recovery. That is no surprise given the priorities of this administration. They have said that they are going to have a focus on reducing unsheltered homelessness, which is, I think, a goal we can all agree with, and on increasing earned income. So curiously, though, we know that the current year competition was funded by the FY 2025 continuing resolution, which basically meant flat funding from FY 2024, there's not enough money there to fund all of the renewals. And yet they have said that they are going to be seeking new project applications, including for street outreach and transitional housing. So likely what that means, or, we'll see when we get the NOFO, but what they have done in the past is basically cannibalize renewals in order to fund new projects. So it's, if things go as they have in recent years, we would expect to see an opportunity for higher performing COCs to basically take money away from lower performing COCs, and that is the way, by reducing funding for renewals, that they can fund these new projects. We do not know, because it was silent, the announcement that came out, whether or not permanent housing will be an eligible new project activity. So we don't know whether permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing will be an eligible new project activity. One hopes at least they continue to fund those renewals. We also know from that brief email that HUD released that they are going to be looking for involvement from faith-based organizations. So that is what we know. We've got Howard, did you want to say something? Oh, okay. We've got a poll. So Rosa, can you launch our poll for us? Just to review some of what we've discussed. There we go. All right. So the first question is, will most renewal projects need to submit a project application in 2025? The second, the president establishes the federal budget. The third, the FY 2026 HUD appropriations bill must be approved by Congress and is subject to the filibuster. We'll give people a few minutes. If you're having trouble using the poll, we know some people have had technical difficulties in Teams using the poll. No worries. Just think to yourselves what your answer would be, or you're also welcome to put it in chat if you prefer. Rosa, I'm not able to see how many people have responded, so you can feel free to close the poll whenever you think.
We have about 7 responses.
Okay, so maybe we'll give people another 10 seconds or so. I think a lot of people probably are having some technical trouble with the poll. Oh, I see, there, I can see it, 7 responses. All right, why don't you go ahead and close the poll, and we'll review the answers. So the first question, most renewal projects will not need to submit a project application in 2025. Sorry, I think I didn't actually cover that when I talked, but it's a maybe, right? We really don't know. We think renewals probably will have to submit a renewal application, but we won't know that until the NOFO comes out. So that's maybe. The next question, the president establishes the federal budget. That is false. Congress establishes the federal budget. So the Constitution gives Congress the power to establish the budget, not the president. So much of what is in the president's budget proposal, it looks like Congress has rejected and will not be in the final budget. And then finally, the FY 26 budget must be approved by Congress and is subject to the filibuster, and that is true. So that is good news for us, because they are going to have to get 60 votes in the Senate. They're going to need to compromise with the Democrats in order to get a budget passed, unless they may not get a budget passed, and they may just do a continuing resolution. So, okay, I'm going to turn it over to Howard.
All right. Here I am. Hi, everybody. Great being with you. Sorry to be presenting some of this information that I am presenting to you. First off, a couple of things about these executive orders. The way it is, a president cannot use an executive order to create a new law or to override what Congress has said. The problem here is, of course, that this administration has a very expansive view of executive orders and what they can do through these executive orders. And on top of that, we have certainly seen a clear demonstration by Congress that it really has very little interest in asserting its authority. So we really can't rely on them to help us that much. So these executive orders are probably going to be a big challenge for us. So these some of the early ones, some of the initial executive orders that were issued took aim at any effort, and you've heard this everywhere, about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they base this initiative against diversity, equity, and inclusion on the Civil Rights Act, suggesting that diversity, equity, and inclusion really is discriminatory against other categories of folks. Treat that as it well. HUD seems to be claiming that DEI efforts are a form of discrimination, but they've not explicitly said that. We must continue to follow all anti-discrimination laws that are in effect, regardless of what it is that HUD says. And also, as shown on this slide, there is Rhode Island law that also prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression in employment, housing, public accommodations, and credit. So that's still going to be Rhode Island law. It's still going to be Rhode Island law, sort of regardless of these federal things. So that's their executive order on DEI. The other one early on was this executive order on gender ideology. Feel free, if you're so inclined, to read these words on this slide. I'm not going to read them to you because the fact of the matter is, from the beginning of time, people have expressed themselves as transgender. From the beginning of time, human beings were actually born not clearly male or female. None of these words that are on this slide have anything to do with science. They're all beliefs, and it's attempting to structure a belief system. It's really harmful to a lot of people to come up with this kind of belief system. It is this executive order with respect to gender ideology is directed to federal agencies and telling federal agencies what they can do with regard to gender ideology. Contractors to the Continuum of Care program, recipients of Continuum of Care funds, are not federal agencies. On top of that, HUD continues to have, there is an equal access rule. We're not going to be providing you training on that, but the equal access rule exists. It has not been repealed. It likely will be at some point in time in the future. But as we speak today, the equal access rule remains in effect. So bear that in mind as you approach this. Basically, the other thing is, as clarified here in some of the legal arguments against this, promote is the thing that you're not allowed to do, but it's not clear what it means to promote a gender ideology, other than, I would say, that promulgating executive orders based on belief systems alone are promoting things as opposed to following science. And again, as I said before, the executive order directs federal agencies as to what they are doing. As it said here, CoC recipients are not federal agencies. Okay, now the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunities Reconciliation Act, the lovely PRORR, specifies that there are supposed to be exceptions to the requirements. One set of exceptions has to do with life or safety, and activities that meet the requirement of addressing life and safety are supposed to be specified by the Attorney General. Prior attorneys general had interpreted this to mean that life and safety includes things like emergency shelter, street outreach, and rapid rehousing. Unfortunately, the Attorney General themselves is allowed to make that determination as to what exceptions there can be. And on July 11th of this month, the Attorney General decided not to accept any benefits from parole, meaning that those exceptions that had been in effect that are on HUD documentation about implementation about parole specifically said that emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and street outreach were exempt from the provisions of this requirement. Those exemptions have now been removed completely by the Attorney General. The language apparently says that the Attorney General is allowed to do it at their reviewable discretion, and that is what has happened. So that will take effect as of August the 15th. So that means that recipients are required to document their immigration eligibility, except for this very important thing, because this is not subject to the discretion of the Attorney General. This was written into the statute, section 432D, says that basically nonprofits are exempt from the requirements to determine, verify, or otherwise require proof of immigration status. So if you are a nonprofit organization and you are the recipient of Continuum of Care funds, you are not required to document the immigration status and their eligibility because of that. That is in the PRWORA Act itself, and so therefore is not subject to the interpretation of the Attorney General. However, if you are a subrecipient of Continuum of Care funds and the recipient, the grantee, is a state or local government entity, then that local government entity has the requirement, and you cannot be exempt from that requirement because you are a nonprofit. The requirement follows the recipient. And so where you are a subrecipient, you're not going to be able to use your nonprofit status as a way to get exempted from this requirement. So we had suspicions because this was under the Attorney General's authority to make this change, and indeed that change has been made. But again, remember, if you're the direct recipient and you're a not-for-profit organization, you are not required to ascertain that status. We're saying here that there's anticipation that there's also going to be a rule. Mixed immigration status households means that if you've got any member of your household who is not a legal immigrant in this country, then what has historically been the case is the assistance would be prorated. You'd get assistance for all the people in the household who were eligible Americans, and you would not get assistance on behalf of the member of the household who was not eligible. The anticipated rule, of course, is going to rule that if you have anybody in your household who is not an eligible American, then the entire household must be denied assistance. But that has not been promulgated yet. Here are some more guidance about how it is. We can help to make LGBTQ plus participants feel safe in our programs. Pay attention to that. That guidance, remember, as we said before, there is Rhode Island state law that does provide protections if you're across the border. In my state of Massachusetts, we also have state laws that provide those protections, and those state laws are going to remain in effect. That Budget Act, that reconciliation bill that was passed signed into law on July the 4th, massively increased funding for immigration agents, for immigration detention. Therefore, by that huge increase in the number of agents, there is a possibility that there'll be even more presence of those agents. It had been a time that homeless shelters were considered to be locations that immigration did not directly go to. They were one of those safe places like a religious place or a court. As you know, there are no safe spaces any longer. There are quotas instead. Therefore, one of this link, what to do before, during, and after an ICE raid, is really useful and very detailed resource. I think everybody should pay attention to that. Some really, really quick takeaways. Be sure, especially if you've got a shelter, there's such a things as public and private areas. In order for anyone to access an area that is designated as a private area, they either have to be allowed to or have a warrant signed by a judge that gives them authorization to do so. So please think about designating areas that are private to give you at least the ability to say to immigration agents, you are not allowed to enter that without a court warrant. The other thing, big takeaway is don't touch them. Whatever you do, no matter how much you want to protect your clients, do not touch those immigration agents that will used as cover to do all kinds of harmful things. But this is a really good resource, what to do before and after an ICE raid. And also this thing about know your rights is unfortunately probably going to be a important and useful document to make sure you share with people who have your services.
There's a question in chat.
Oh.
So I think it refers to the previous comment that you had made. Is Rhode Island Housing considered a state entity for the purposes of HUD?
Elizabeth, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd say that it is, yeah?
Yes, we are.
So as things, what HUD has said to date is that they are not going to enforce the requirements for Housing First. That's all we know. We do know that we have a explicit policy for the Rhode Island Continuum of Care that endorses the Housing First model. We do it not because we believe in it. We do it because it has been demonstrated and there's evidence and there's science that supports the effectiveness of the model. We're open to any model that can be demonstrated effective at ending people's homelessness. Housing First has passed that test. That is why it is a project program model that we use in this continuum of care. Until we hear otherwise, it is a program model that will continue to be employed in this continuum of care, but stay tuned. With respect to the upcoming NOFO, as it said, the best case is they will allow projects to continue following Housing First. They may provide incentives in terms of points, new projects, new funding, to not use the Housing First model, which is to require all recipients or all participants to demonstrate sobriety or also demonstrate a commitment to take medications as directed, etc. So that might be that those approaches might be incentivized in the upcoming competition, or who knows? I mean, again, in this worst case, but there's no basis for this saying this, but that HUD may prohibit Housing First. That's just there. But no one suggested that at this point, but no one suggested a lot of things that have happened. So the National Homelessness Law Center is doing some great work to try and address these grant agreements. They are making it very clear that a lot of the language that they're putting in these grant agreements are ambiguous, and things that are really not clear in grant language are not really enforced by courts. And remember, even in the worst case, it's referring to specific activities that are funded under your Continuum of Care grants. It's not everything your organization does. It's not everything in the world. It's going to be targeted towards specific activities. However, there is, I think we're going to have it here. Yeah, so there's a really good, well, I'll take that back. There was litigation in King County in the state of Washington versus Turner, the secretary of HUD. Basically, it was against these new provisions in the HUD Continuum of Care contracts. It was filed by these multiple jurisdictions. You can see them on the slide here. I guess the closest was the good old city of Boston as one of the plaintiffs in this case. There was a preliminary injunction basically prohibiting HUD from implementing any of that contractual language in CoC grants, but it only applied to the plaintiffs. So you had to be, that's part of what our Supreme Court has done, as to try and stop these nationwide injunctions. So it only is applying to the specific plaintiffs who were entered into the court, and it basically is challenging the stuff on diversity, equity, inclusion, gender ideology, and on immigration issues. So that is proceeding. It's gotten a good hearing before the judge, and it's entirely possible that court would, upon the decision, would have ramifications for all continuum of care grants in the country. So stay tuned for developments on that score. Yes.
Bill put a helpful comment in here. It says that there's also been a lawsuit filed in district court here in Rhode Island, late breaking news as of last week, and that there are several providers that are participating.
But Bill,
Thank
do you want to
you.
talk to that at all? Thank you. You're absolutely right. Just remark that, please.
Yep. Yeah. So there was a pretty broad-based coalition of providers, some here in Rhode Island, some in other jurisdictions across the state, regarding these, that both conditions in the HUD grants and in HHS grants that have been issued. So it was some homeless service providers. House of Hope is one of the plaintiffs, and a lot of homeless service providers, domestic violence providers, and such. And so there has been a TRO issued as of Thursday regarding some of the awardees with contracts beginning on 8/1/25. Tomorrow. So we're in the process of doing that here in Rhode Island on behalf of about 20 other providers nationwide.
Thanks for that update, Bill. Thank you.
You are welcome.
And if things weren't enough, you probably know that this new executive order came out. The executive order, is pushed the notion of civil commitment, basically allowing involuntary hospitalization or involuntary custodization of unhoused individuals who are unable to care for themselves or posing a public risk. And I think they would say that anyone who is living unhoused is posing a public risk by their being there. So, of course, and it basically is saying that federal grants should be more towards enforcing bans on open drug use, street camping, loitering or squatting, living without a home, talking about taking funding away from harm reduction and housing first programs and focusing on enforced treatment. And also would require the collection of personal health related information and the sharing of that information. There's no question that this executive order, it's highly likely this executive order will have a huge impact on the upcoming NOFO. The HUD secretary has clearly walked in lockstep with the administration. No sooner had the president declared that the name of the Washington football team should revert to a racist term did the Secretary of HUD chime in saying that is absolutely what must occur. As a matter of fact, while I'm talking about the Secretary of HUD, when that July 3rd email that Lauren referenced before was sent out, it also had the HUD Secretary said, it is HUD's mission to steward resources so that no person is left to languish on our streets or suffer in the grip of addiction. It is HUD's mission. So just, out of curiosity, if you actually look up what HUD's mission is to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all. That's HUD's mission from HUD's website. Okay. All right. We have a poll here, which we better have here because it'll be useful to me at this point in time. So if we could launch this, we just have 3 questions. One is true or false, CoC projects are no longer permitted to use the Housing First model. Secondly is not-profit organizations are not required to verify the immigration status of applicants for assistance. And 3, King County versus Turner has temporarily blocked implementation of the new HUD grant agreement in terms across the country. We know that there's a whole other case in Rhode Island District Court. So please, when you get a chance to answer those questions and we'll move on. Okay, I think we can end it now and keep going. Okay, well, everybody got it right that it's false that CoC projects are no longer permitted to use the Housing First model. Everyone got that right. Overwhelmingly, we got it correct that nonprofit organizations are not required to verify the immigration status of applicants. And so it is false. It is not blocked the implementation across the country, but as Bill has informed us, we may have a different situation based on the district court case in Rhode Island. Okay, so we want to talk about how it is that we can sort of work on managing some of this uncertainty that we are. Okay, and Bill has indicated in the chat here, important, that it only is going to apply to the organizations that any injunctive relief at this moment will only apply to organizations that were named plaintiffs. of which we know House of Hope was one. So I recommend you also to take a look. We're going to briefly talk about some of the information that's here on this guide to managing uncertainty, but it's a really good resource, many pages associated with it. So we've got the link here. Please take a look at that, and hopefully it will assist you some. We want to talk about how we can work with new information, how we can make sure that we apply trauma-informed principles when we're communicating folks, and ways in which we can manage our grants and adapt our budgets. So one thing, by the way, is, and this is something that certainly came out as a great concern when it looked like they were limiting access to the ELOCs, which of course, as hopefully everyone knows, that's the electronic line of credit control system. It's the way in which HUD advances funds from the federal treasury to recipient bank accounts. And basically, since we did have that scare when folks had difficulty being able to access that system, since then we really recommend that folks access it as regularly as possible. The requirements are of a CoC grant that you must draw down funds every quarter at least. Ever since that scare with ELOCs, the recommendation is usually that folks draw down funds every month, just to make sure that you stay on top of it in case something does go wrong in the future. Also, just, sort of maintenance stuff. It is, if you get locked out of this system, it is challenging to get back into it. It's much more complicated than getting back into the eSNAP system. So you really don't want to lose access to it. Also, as many of you know, you are allowed to draw down funds on the grant up to 90 days after the end of that grant term, only for expenses that were incurred during the grant term. But if you end up locked out of the system and this clock is ticking against you and you don't get back into the system until after the last date in which you can draw those funds, you've lost those funds. You can never draw them down. So it really is very, very important that you maintain your access to the ELOC system, and at the very least, very least, every 90 days, just log into that system, do some queries, check balances. This way it'll note that you were in there. By the way, we don't have a slide on this, but they did a similar thing to the eSNAP system. Remember, eSNAPs is the system that we use to apply for and manage grants, Continuum of Care grants. Now there's a 90-day clock on that system as well. If you have not logged into your eSNAPs account within 90 days, you will be locked out. Not quite as complicated to get back in that system, but it is a manual process. It requires somebody to physically reset your password for you. And so if they're got a lot of things going on, or it's a weekend or something like that, it may take a little longer for you to get back into that system. So those of you who've in eSNAPs, I mean, the competition is coming up. I'd recommend all of you in the not distant future to log into eSNAPs to make sure your account is still current, and if it isn't, work on resetting that password so you can get back into it when you're going to need to, because you will need to do so fairly soon. This ELOC's quick reference guide is very valuable to you in case you're not familiar with that. Again, obviously, across the board, good things that you always want to do is you've always got to make sure that you're complying with all your regulations. You want to make sure that you're only serving eligible persons under the program. If they change the eligibility requirements, you want to make sure that you are following. They have the authority to come in, and if you ever expend funds on behalf of people who are not eligible to receive those funds, they will not hesitate to say that they will recapture those. They will insist that you pay those funds back to the federal government. As always, it's always been our goal when these grants are awarded to you to fully spend them. When it says build reserves, don't combine those two thoughts. You don't want to build reserves by drawing down HUD funds and not spending them and putting them in your reserve account. Any funds that you draw down from the federal government must be expended on eligible CoC activities. They cannot be put into a reserve. But if you have other sources of funding, if you're doing other fundraising, if you've got thrift stores, any other ways in which you can raise revenues, this is certainly the time to do it. A lot of organizations have found entrepreneurial ways to thrift shops in particular to raise revenues for their organization. This is certainly the time to have some of those independent reserves funding if there ever was a time to it. Team approach to crisis management. I think it is important. If These are such stressful times that it really is useful to put together a team of folks in your organization to be responsible for sort of analyzing what's going on and making a plan for going forward. If it falls entirely on the head of the executive director, the director of finance, it's going to be overwhelmingly stressful. So try and come up with a leadership team that can be supportive of each other, because there's just a lot that we're going to have to deal with. Well, we know. I mean, so trauma was common even before all these recent events, and certainly most everyone who's experienced homelessness, who's experienced trauma, the extent to which we've been successful in having people with lived experience be leaders in our efforts means that, we've had all kinds of people who've had traumatic experiences. We all have had our various forms of traumatic things. These changes day to day, reading the newspaper is unsettling. Keeping up on these court cases, keeping up on all these executive orders, the Attorney General's determinations, there are many things that we do not know. Everybody needs support. So try and bear in mind that, when we're communicating, when these news are, everyone is shocked, everyone is stressed, and be as mindful of this as you can be. Think about ways in advance about how it is that you're going to convey information to staff and to clients as well. People are going to get this information quickly, so you want to be able to provide your version as soon as possible. As I said, this crisis response team, try not to have everything fall on the shoulders of just a single person. It is much too much. If you can rotate responsibility, take some things off of people's shoulders, that will be good. Find ways that you're not spending all of your time on this overwhelming topic, because it will just be too stressful. Communicate face to face, of course, but you also want to make sure you want to do all those basic things about active listening, not to be judgmental, not to be defensive. Share your own personal vulnerabilities as you're going through it, and try and use open-ended questions to try to get information from folks, and avoid assuming things. Don't try and be Pollyanna and say that everything is great. At the same time, don't be too much like me and suggest that things really are really dreadful. Again, what more can we say? I mean, you see these things. It's a really challenging, very difficult time to communicate with folks. Do what you can. Try and provide as honest a communication. If we know that we're going to lose funding, provide that information so people can make their own plans. Do whatever we can to mitigate the impacts as much as possible. Again, so much of this is speculative at this point in time. We don't know what it is, but it is entirely possible that some existing grants will not be renewed, and we need to think through how we will handle if there is a reduction in funding and support for the organization, how we will sustain what is critical. So, well, the other thing I want to say is there are a lot of ways in which we can take care of ourselves. I mean, obviously, unlike what we're asking you to do, which is to sit still and stare at a screen for 2 hours, that's actually not good for your health. Would suggest you be active. It really helps to be active. It helps to spend some time in nature. It helps spending time with kids and with pets. It really helps to identify what our creative outlets are and spend some time on our own creativity. And you can be free to not pay attention to everything that's going on, because there are more important things in your life sometimes. So on that note, we're going to try this chat waterfall thing here, which is the concept here is you want to put something in the chat box, but you don't want to press the send, that little paper airplane symbol, until we tell you to do. So first, say something that makes you hopeful. And secondly, or something that you do to take care of yourself. Now put something in the chat box to that effect, and then wait, because then we will suddenly say, release it all, and we will have, a cascade of positive things. So just keep waiting to, hopefully you're typing your responses in there, but don't share them until we are all typed in. Yeah? Okay, hit send. Oh, that's great. Exercise, yeah. Yoga, totally. A lot of dogs. Eating good food, totally. Yeah, there are beautiful beaches here. Any more? Oh, there are more. I'm not going down them. Yeah, listening to music, kindness of other, yoga, community, video games, listening to audio. I like audiobooks too. Going on walks. Yeah, it's great being out walking. Yes, and we're praying for the youth, that's for sure. And video games can be a great escape too. Well, okay, thank you. Hopefully people have heard some of these things, maybe heard some other things that they can do to help them get through these troublesome times. Some contingency planning, again, look through, unfortunately, leadership of agencies are going to have to look through some scenarios of what to do with reduced funding. Are there other sources of funding? I mean, obviously, as we know, it's not just the homeless assistance that is coming under, I don't know what word to use, but obviously although those mainstream resources exist, of course, it is our clients who are going to be most subject to and most vulnerable to these funding and Medicaid cutbacks. We should since Lauren made it very clear before that there is some risk that emergency solutions grants might become our primary funding mechanism. Let's take a look, as Bill mentioned, issues about how we can use rapid rehousing under that. So let's take a look at, what ESG can be used for. Also, again, really good presentation that was at the most recent National Alliance Conference at the start of this month, how to think about the unthinkable. Again, we are in it together, especially, many of us develop, very good relationships. Certainly we've got our tax credit funded projects where I think we need to have good communication with those investors to let them know that what we're doing and we're trying to maintain their projects, maintaining that strong positive relationship with local law enforcement and emergency services. They can be our friends in these instances. And obviously, we've got to keep our bridges open to landlords, that we're going to make our best efforts to keep them as whole as possible, because we don't have programs without engagement with them as well. Okay, so we're going to have actually another session in our ongoing series of these training sessions. It's going to happen August the 5th, which is next Tuesday, right? Yes, I think. My calendar, I think. So August the 5th.
Yes.
Thank you. At 10 a.m. These are the topics that we're covering: the policy and administrative requirements, the equal access rule. I said it's still in effect, so we will talk about it. Participation by people with lived experience, non-discrimination, fair housing, reasonable accommodations, participant rights, the violence against women, all these things, code of conduct. All this stuff is going to be what we're going to be talking about for 2 hours starting at 10 a.m. on August the 5th. We've got another final. Is it our final one on the 20th of August? We've got another session also coming up on the 20th of August talking about fiscal matters. Here are, convenient to you have these slides. So here are the linkages to where the additional training, what the additional trainings are, and also a link to the recordings of any of the sessions that we've had already. Are there any questions or suggestions?
I just put a link in the chat box to the evaluation for this session. So if people would please fill out the evaluation, and I think that that's the pathway for Sarah on our team to get anybody who would like one a certificate that you've done this training. So that link is in the chat. And it looks like Rosa also put links to register for the August 5th and the August 20th sessions in the chat as well.
If we're not, wait, are there messages? No. If there are not questions or further discussion, we got about a little over 15 minutes that we may be able to get back to you.
Thank you, Howard and Lauren.